whenever I hear the word career, like most teachers, it sort of implies some great sort of structured, measured, thoughtful approach to life. I was aware of the fact that when I left school that I really did like the idea of being a teacher. So being a teacher was something that came very early on. And I also loved school generally, and I liked academic things. So I was very lucky to have a gap year where I worked overseas as a teacher for a full year, and that didn't serve to persuade me away from the profession, quite the reverse. So after university, I got my first job, which was in teaching, and I taught for 9 years at Eton, and did all of the things that you do in your 20s whenever you're starting any career, which is lots of things that are immediately relevant and fulfilling, and lots of things that didn't feel immediately relevant and indeed might not have been fulfilling, but they all turned out to be relevant and useful in the long term and gave some very, very powerful experiences. I was then fortunate to be selected to be House Master of the Scholars at Winchester College, which is something I did for 9 years before coming to Harrow as Deputy Head, a job I did for nearly 4 years, before then moving up to Derbyshire to be Headmaster of Repton School. 3 years in a wonderful, ancient, fantastically progressive establishment, Repton, before, and much to my amazement, coming back here to Harrow in 2019 to be its headmaster. So I've done just over 2 years here now. That's a very interesting and very broad-ranging question, and it comes to the heart of, why does anyone get involved in education at all? My priorities are to ensure that the pupils who are in my school, as it would be for any head or principal, are having the best learning and educational journey that they possibly can, so that when they do the thing which is actually enigmatically the most important thing about school, which is leaving it, that they leave it absolutely set for the real world into which they're going. So in terms of priorities, I suppose number one, I have to understand that real world into which the boys who leave Harrow School are going, and understanding how our education can do the very best job that it can for fitting them to that. Recognizing that in any given year group, there are 180 leavers, and that they are individuals, and therefore the way in which they meet the real world will be individual. So making sure that education is both relevant and therefore has some sense of contemporary and being up to date, but also has in it all of those enduring key features that education always has had in terms of building character, understanding what human relationships are, how they build together, and how you can build self-efficacy for every individual so they can thrive as an adult. So that's quite a broad ranging and rather sort of top level list of priorities. For where independent schools are in particular in the 21st century, I was clear when I came in 2019, and this had been thoroughly agreed with the governors, what my 5 priorities would be for the school. And I know we'll be talking a little bit more about this to come, but my work has been obviously to respond to the prevailing circumstances that we've all been going through, making sure that response is the best one that we could make, but at the same time ensuring that that 5-point strategy has remained not sort of merely sort of intact and just about together, but actually unfolded, actually developed, and that as a school we've continued to grow and develop. Like all institutions, whether they're educational or not, we have the incident management plan and policy, and it sits on its folder, on its desk, and there it is.
Yeah.
And we had interestingly done a few tabletop exercises with key members of the management team, just to sort of rehearse ourselves and test ourselves a little bit, and see how we would respond. But of course, most of the scenarios that we'd allowed ourselves to think about hadn't involved particularly for a boarding school, the idea of not having any pupils on site at all, which as a boarding school is, and a school where we have no day pupils whatsoever, was something, was a long way outside our consideration set. I do recall, though, early in January 2020, when this was coronavirus was becoming something that was in the news, we were beginning to get the first indications of what it would be like. Speaking to my two deputies informally one morning, coming out of our staff briefing, saying, "Well, we have this platform, we have the VLE, we've got the hardware, we've got the software. Something we'll come on to a little bit later. What would it be like if we did move everything online? We think we've got the theoretical capacity to do it. Well, at least that's what all of our IT gurus are telling me. Could it happen? Would it work?" I'm not sure that we'd completely answered that question by the time it came that we had to do it. But what we had done was that we had prepared people, and we had been able to take the opportunity to train people on going from a sort of very entry level use of both the software and the hardware to a way in which it could stand up for an entire lesson and would work. So from that point of view, I was really pleased that when I had to sign a letter, which I just came across recently, to all of the parents saying we were temporarily suspending educational operations on the Hill, which, when you haven't quite done 2 years in post, felt like a pretty momentous bit of ink to be driving across a page. We gave ourselves 48 hours off. And then the next week, we were, for the final week of term, fully online. And that was a powerful and vindicating moment. I suppose it would start out with the first point is that we have very, very well developed links and partnerships with schools in our immediate community, and that way predates the pandemic, something where we have been carefully and appropriately building the trusting relationships so that we are integrated into our local community. So we were starting on the basis of formed partnerships, formed relationships, trust, and also the knowledge that we don't have the answers just because we're Harrow School. That's a ridiculous assumption to make. It's not our place to assume that. So the way in which we drove things was more in the direction of, tell us what you need that you think we can do, and we will be happy to attempt to achieve that. And I think this has come out in two lines, principally. One, working with a couple of nearby local authorities, where we have done some one-to-one mentoring, and this has grown over the course of the pandemic, of children in looked after settings. So children who are not actually living at home, they have a different educational and social background, and for our staff to provide that one-to-one mentoring tuition. And that is something that I hope, independent of the pandemic, just continues to grow and develop. And then the other element was in our fundraising. So this does rely brilliantly on the sort of the young teenage enthusiast, which is a fantastic thing to capitalize upon and say, this year, because we do very big fundraising every year, this year's annual fundraising effort is going to be targeted towards assisting local young people make the best out of this pandemic situation. So in a whole lot of interventions, some of which were, so last summer 2020, a lot of local charities coming onto our site, making use of all of the facilities in a way that they wanted, all the way through to us raising funds to equip primary schools with Chromebooks to attempt to bridge that digital divide. There were lots of ways in which we could intervene, contributing to local food banks, right to the fundamentals of life. So I was pleased to be able to do that. but also cause to reflect humbly on the level of intervention that was being asked for. And that for me was instructive and gave me pause for thought. So yeah, Harrow School Online, which seems like a sort of child of our times, was actually something that the school had been thinking about before I had come on board as head. So the first drum beats for it were in 2018, and it was a work in progress by the time I arrived. So in a sense, I arrived in time for it to be launched. The recognition there was that in concert with our commercial partner there, Pearson, we thought that there was in the online space, and it's now one which is very crowded. There was a segment in the market for very high quality online education that, if you like, had at its center an educational model such as Harrow School could provide and could develop. So, our heads of department here providing the framework and the structure for the initial teaching, but that whether you're thinking in terms of day school, as many of our international schools are, or Harrow School itself, which is of course fully boarding, there are many young people all the way across the world for whom that type of educational setting just doesn't work with their life. A simple example might be a very, very high level performer in music or drama or sport. It doesn't really quite fit the normal day-to-day programs of going in and out of school in a rather sort of fixed way. Equally well, there might be particular issues that could be, I don't know, familial, social approaches to learning that are just down to the individual, where maybe being at home, and of course homeschooling isn't exactly a novelty, might work better. And the more I found out about this, the more I realized that we were actually taking the best of all sorts of ideas that had already existed in Australia, in those parts that aren't in those sort of urban hubs around the edge. There are entire communities where young people had been educated through the radio, and they just listened on the radio to go to school. So in some senses, we were trying to distill all of this and be the inheritors of all of that. And we went out online with a program that was focused on sciences, maths, and economics for the sixth form, on a simple basis that we thought that we would probably get most traction most quickly in those areas, establish the competences that we needed before growing outwards. So you're right to home in on the fact that we are currently sixth form only, and we're looking, as we have developed in the pandemic, which was an unexpected sort of crucible and proving ground, so that we know that in the next academic year and two, we do want to develop and change that. So without treading on some commercially sensitive areas, that is something where we are going to go beyond what our current offering is. But it's been lovely to work in that way, and to involve our online sort of offering alongside what we have been learning about online as Harrow School, as a boarding school. It's an interesting phenomenon, independent education, which of course in the United Kingdom is a very small slice of the school-going population. In other geographies around the world, independent education occupies a much larger part, and sometimes it can be the dominant part of how education is provided in a given country. But in the United Kingdom, people tend to be quite fiercely tribal about their independent education. So if you're with the school, you tend to stay with the school, a little bit like banks used to be, if you can remember that. Whereas around the world, people are, and I don't mean this at all simplistically, but people are a little bit more consumerist about their fee-paying education. They'll drop one and pick one up as freely as you might do something else. So the key thing for us is that we articulate the value of what we're doing, and how this type of online education isn't comparable to other ones, which seem to be making a similar sounding offering. So for us, we knew that the pandemic wasn't just suddenly going to sort of drop in our lap and be, the sort of the serious pay dirt that we, that others might have foreseen, because you need to be a discerning parent and indeed a discerning student when you're dealing with people who are at the sort of sixth form area, for people to go, oh, I see what that one is offering and why we want to buy on with that one. And we are, of course, also selective as well, which means that it doesn't necessarily scale instantaneously. Yeah, and that, of course, is the interesting thing that we have, being a family of schools. So Harrow School, all of the international schools, Harrow School Online, and also John Lyon School, which is an independent day school, also here on the hill, which is part of the same foundation. Schools with autonomy, operating to a large degree independently, but also collaboratively. You find that everyone's got a different solution for the same problem, mainly because they define the problem differently at the beginning. So, you go in with different assumptions. For Harrow School, the fact that we have, and already did have, every pupil in the school and every teacher in the school with the same piece of hardware to the same specification, maintained by the same staff, all running the same software, and that we had already begun to build up quite a considerable competence in OneDrive, Teams, how that interacted with Firefly, which is the sort of the other part of the sequence. We knew that was going to hold up and be robust. Interestingly, Harrow School Online has done things with a different piece of software, which isn't surprising, because of course they know that at the far end they're dealing with a very large array of hardware, because you can't say to students you're going to have this, because they are anywhere in the world and they could have anything at home. For an online school, as opposed to a school that has gone online and then hybrid and then fully on the ground and then done that loop once through again in the space of 16 months. For a fully online school, you do have to have different solutions, because you're not trying to do fully synchronous live content all the time, which is what we were doing as a school that had gone online. As an online school, you're also meant to be offering, and do offer, a huge amount of asynchronous self-study resource for the pupils to engage with themselves independently, and therefore your trade-offs are different. The extent to which they were known and integrated was, I would say, nearly complete. But nearly complete in the context that you're operating on the ground. So if you wanted, for whatever reason, to do something with paper and pen, you wanted to verbally inform people, you wanted someone to write something down in ink, this is pre-pandemic, then of course that could still happen and could still be part of your culture and could still work. The difference, of course, was that we had to stop doing anything that was analog at all and move it all completely and reliably digital. Now, things that aren't necessarily to do with EdTech platforms, that did, of course, mean all sorts of people were doing a lot of things differently. So, I would normally stand up in a very, very big room and talk to all of the school on a weekly basis. Even when we weren't online, I still couldn't do that because of social distancing. So becoming me personally, individual, quite expert at talking to my Surface Book in various locations around the school, making videos of myself, editing them, and then uploading them, was a skill that I had to learn, basically in a day. And lots of colleagues were learning other skills instantly in a day, and then practicing them so that they could teach a full working day online, and that the pupils could submit work online and it could, go backwards and forwards, that we could proctor tests and assessments in a way that still had rigor and reliability. All of those things happened, and happened, not seamlessly. Of course, it would be a fib to say that it was seamless, but we were open to it. It was a successful learning process, and amazing and astonishing feats of creativity come out of these sorts of things. Absolutely, and that again comes back to a piece which is quite closely linked to safeguarding, because both the hardware and the software have to be appropriate, they have to be rigorous, they have to be secure, and we have to know that it's going to run on the platform and stand up and all of those sorts of things. So it starts in departments where there will be an IT champion for the department who is working closely with both the academic colleagues who are the pioneers in looking at new things and new technology, but also those working on the non-teaching side who are responsible for providing the infrastructure and making sure that the network works, and all of those sorts of things. So it is all, I guess, yes, it is all quite tightly and centrally controlled, but you'd expect that for a school, and it would have to be that for a school. We do have those who are the pioneers and the horizon seekers who will and we encourage them to be looking out there and finding stuff that looks good, and some of them and some of our most leading edge boys, the ones who are doing computer science and that sort of thing, will do some pretty exciting things, but those are more to do with IT or computer science as a subject, as opposed to a sort of whole institution change. And then of course the governance goes a level up, and we have specific members of our governing board who are sort of overseeing all of those elements too. Well, that's interesting. I mean, like many institutions, we run the Microsoft Office suite as a lot of people do, and we've chosen a particular piece of hardware too, which is allied with that, and we've then put it through 16 months of basically having to do everything, from the headmaster's goofy weekly videos to making sure that we can submit data to exam boards for teacher assessed grades that we know will stand up to scrutiny. So it's a pretty tough challenge, and there have been some things around the margins where we thought, well, that could have been slicker, that could have been neater, that might have been, but they were small percentage things. At no point did it fall over, or at no point did we think, oh, let's just ditch the whole thing and start again. So from that point of view, really content. And of course, functionality improved over the course of that 18 months as well. More features were added in. Simple things. If you're teaching a class of people, it's quite nice to be able to see all of the class of people online all at once. And having a screen that only started out with sort of 4 people visible, then became 9, then became many more than that. Those are things that, if you are, in inverted commas, managing a classroom, whether it's it is online, make a huge difference. And being able to segment a class into rooms, so that they can actually do group work like you might do in a classroom, and then be brought back in again. Again, those things make a difference because they are closer to what a teacher might be used to doing in their own classroom. So from that point of view, yeah, it's impressive and it works well. And I think we need to be maybe a little bit more gracious and grateful about, isn't it amazing that did work? It really did hold up. And both, the educational professionals and the students were able to engage with it for very long periods of time. An entire term online, live, with nearly all of the content being live as opposed to asynchronous. That's a tall order. So in terms of adoption and adaptation, it wasn't the technology that we adapted. We actually adapted our working day. So we changed the length of lessons, we changed the length of breaks between lessons. We looked at the time of day that our lessons were happening and whether it was daylight outside, which is important in the winter lockdown, because if it's daylight outside, you actually want the children to be enjoying some daylight outside and not, especially if that daylight's limited. Changing what we did with some of the lessons, because if you have your pupil body, okay, mostly it's in the UK and Europe, but it's also on both coasts of the United States, in Australia and New Zealand, and in Southeast Asia, and in West Africa, and a sort of a gentle dotting of people around the globe all the way in between, you'll realize that you're sort of nearly running a 24-hour operation. So allowing ways for people to develop, for people to catch up. You can't expect people to sort of log on at 2 o'clock in the morning local time just so that they can be online at the same time as everyone else. So those were refinements that we had to ensure were there and were practical to allow all the boys to make progress. I think a lot is defined by institutional or national courage. So it depends on who is running the school and what their jurisdiction is around the world. But one thing I have in my mind's eye is a school where we take the best of what we have just learned, and maybe put it into a wholly new school format where quite deliberately we don't actually expect a pupil to be in school all of the time. Maybe we do expect them to be learning at a distance, learning remotely, because for a period of time they're going off and doing a project for 6 weeks, which has enormous educational value, which they couldn't do if they were coming into school every day. But they can still keep in touch with their school and still be making progress. So looking at the educational journey a lot more flexibly, and that comes from my experience of boys here who couldn't have what they normally expect from Harrow School here on the hill. And very quickly, what they did was they took what they had on the hill and took it back home. And so, they couldn't do community service here at Harrow School. So instead, they invented their own community service program at home, implemented it, impact assessed it, and did all of the things that they had, had role modeled towards them. And we shouldn't lose things like that. We shouldn't lose moments like that where we see how people can change the great things that already happen in education and put them in a different context and make them fly. So that's the sort of thing I would expect to see schools in the future doing and applauding, and also being able to sort of certify, authenticate, and make part of the qualifications portfolio.